As the dark season of Halloween approaches, I thought it would be fun to take a short break from the craziness of the news cycle in order to highlight the true Christian history of Vlad the Impaler, who would go on to inspire the well known myth that is Dracula. What lessons can we learn from this dark story? On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by author Raymond Ibrahim to discuss all this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the intro, I am joined by Raymond Ibrahim. So, Raymond, go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who are not yet familiar.
Sure, Connor. I'm primarily a writer, author of books and columns, articles, etc., mostly about Islam, past and present, especially its intersection with the West, especially the Christian West. So I write books about crusades and jihad and so forth. I also look at what's happening in the modern context with Islamic terrorism, the persecution of Christians throughout the Islamic world. Been doing it for almost 20 years, actually. My first article, I was reminded, was published by the LA Times in 2005. So in a few months, it'll be 20 years. Yeah, a little burned out on it, but still, ironing away. And currently working on another book. I think you're familiar with my books, especially Defenders of the West, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam, and and before that there was Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War between Islam and the West. And I'm working on it's become a trilogy of sorts. I have a third book coming up that's going to deal with the very same themes. But I'll get into that some other time since it's still in its nascent stages. And other than that, I'm a fellow at some think tanks. And I guess that's it. My family's from Egypt. They're what's called Coptic Christians, the native inhabitants of Egypt, the original inhabitants before it was conquered by Islam. So that's why I have an interest in these topics. I know the languages, Arabic and others as well. There it is.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you back. And for those of you who did not watch our very first episode we did, it's already been a good 6-7 months since we put it out. But just type in Raymond Ibrahim in the search bar on my YouTube or on the podcast platform, and it should pull up for you. And we talked all about the Crusades and some of the myths surrounding them and what really happened with the Crusades. And towards the end of the episode, I mentioned how we needed to do an episode all about the real story of Dracula. So that's what we're discussing tonight. Before we get started, though, feel free to go on over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is where I put up every single episode of the show. When it hits podcast platforms, if you put in your email, I will send out an email the moment that an episode drops. So that is completely free, and there is an option to leave a tip in the tip jar if you feel inclined. And then, of course, you can follow me on X at ForgeandA. It does help me out to get new followers, and I will keep you updated on the show as well as provide some additional content. And then, of course, share this video far and wide. Hit the like button. It really does help us break through the algorithm and gets this out in front of more people. So that's all the laundry out of the way. So, yeah, we'll go ahead and just dive right in there, Raymond. So, yeah, of course, Dracula is obviously a character that most people in the West are familiar with. We're familiar with some sort of caricature of Dracula, sort of a Nosferatu sort of blood-sucking vampire, just become sort of a Halloween myth. And in recent days, it seems like that myth is even glorified by individuals who really love Halloween and love to dabble in that darkness. So obviously, the myth of Dracula is not where the story of Vlad the Impaler begins. So I'll kind of just turn it over to you to kind of talk through Vlad the Impaler's kind of humble beginnings. Give us a little bit of a background as to who Vlad is and where he initially comes from.
Sure. Well, to kind of pick off where you left off, most people know him from the novel Dracula, which I think was published in 1897 by Bram Stoker, an Irishman. Mm-hmm. And, like all good novelists, he tried to give his story a veneer of reality. So he looked into the histories and he found real people and places to try to give it that, veneer of legitimacy. And he settled on Vlad the Impaler, who is Dracula. A lot of people don't realize Dracula is actually part of his real name. It just means the son of the dragon, and the dragon was his father, who was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was a Christian fraternity of sorts, an order that was dedicated to resisting the Ottoman Turks at the time. So that's his his so-called surname. But he's Vlad, and he's known as the Impaler. And the thing about him is, we all know, instinctively at least understand it's a novel and it's not true. But when you really dig into, the whole genesis of how Vlad the Impaler becomes Dracula, it's funny because it's part of the whole, fake news. All right, we know fake news and what it means. It's kind of like oftentimes assassinating someone's character or whatever. I mean, think of Trump, for example. That's the big example. But that's exactly what it was with Vlad. When you think about it, he was and is today in Romania, his native country, seen as a hero. So how is it this guy from being a hero is now in our culture a blood-sucking monster, or even less than that? How is he this evil impaler, which we'll get to, the historical aspect. So basically, in the histories, Vlad appears as he's a voivode or a warlord of Romania, which is Wallachia. This is now right around the 1420s or 30s. The Ottoman Empire is expanding into the Balkans, including in Romania and Hungary, and it's terrorizing everyone, all the Christians. And so that's the context where he comes from. It's just constant warfare between the Ottomans and the small Christian nations. Hungary is one of the stronger nations compared to Romania or Wallachia. And I want to say the date's 1428, he becomes the voivode or warlord. Then he gets overthrown, then he comes back into power. Anyway, long story short, it was a very turbulent time, including amongst the Christians and the Europeans themselves, who were very often, a lot of them would work for the Ottomans and essentially betray their own people, and lots of shifting alliances. So it's a very convoluted time. And, his father was killed, his older brother was buried alive. So he kind of entered it. And then when he became the leader, he got ousted immediately and was almost killed. So, in that context, it was a very kind of like dog eat dog world. And it explains, the cruelty that comes out afterwards. So basically, he fought fire with fire. When it comes to, he established himself again on the throne. And then very soon the Ottomans started, they sent emissaries to him. And the emissaries were wearing turbans. So he also had, among everything else, he had a very dark sense of humor. So they came to his castle high up in the mountains, Carpathian Mountains. So that part's real, which we see in the mountains, in the movie, sorry. And they climbed all the way up. And when he saw them, he told them, why haven't you removed your turbans in front of me, royalty? And they said our religion. And they started talking about Islam, et cetera, which he, of course, understood, because in the years before that, as a youth, he was a hostage of the Ottomans, he and his brother. And his brother actually was kept a hostage and became essentially the boy toy of the Sultan. All right, and that's how it actually comes out in the sources. He was a catamite, and that's what Ottomans, had a big thing for pederasty, as they would call it. It was known as a Turkish disease. At any rate, so that's his crazy background, and he was in jail. And when he was in jail amongst the Ottomans, and this is in his early teens, he was constantly beaten, whipped, and he saw impalement. So we'll get to that. We attribute impalement to him, but it's really something he learned from watching the Ottomans. Okay, so now he's there now in Romania. He's in charge, and these emissaries come. So, and after he tells them remove your turbans, and they say no, he tells them, well, I'm going to help your religion, and I'm going to help you keep your turbans fastened. And he ordered men to nail their turbans on their head, okay, and sent them home saying, tell the Sultan, we don't want your customs here. So that's the sort of guy he was. And obviously, this isn't, by modern day standards, he's definitely, you can call him cruel and sadistic and so forth. But again, I bring up fake news because the issue with fake news is not so much that the facts that you're presented are false, it's that they're presented in a vacuum and you're not told of all the other things. So for example, part of fake history is to present slavery as this sort of white man phenomenon. And, just whites created slavery and started enslaving everyone. And before that, no one enslaved anyone. So in that context, I mean, you don't have to lie. Yeah, whites enslaved, that's true. But without knowing everyone did it, obviously it looks so bad. And so that's what we have going on here with Vlad. We hear about his cruelty, but that was pretty standard. So like I said, the Ottomans are the ones who really perfected impalement. Even other Christian groups it was on their codes as part of the punishments for various crimes, impalement. Okay, but he really resorted to it once the Ottomans, after that incident, when the emissaries came, because the emissaries, what they wanted was money, tribute, the usual Islamic, tribute, as well as maybe you're familiar with the concept of janissaries, where they would seize Christian boys from subject territories, and usually the strongest and healthiest and smartest boys, and turn them into Ottoman either fighters or administrators, and then unleash them back on their people. It was a very kind of vicious cycle where you bleed the Christians of their very best and empower your own, the jihadist army with them. And they would be indoctrinated in Islam and et cetera, because they were taken very young. And so that's partially what happened to him when he was taken, he and his brother, though obviously a lot of them rose above the, indoctrination aspects. Anyway, these emissaries wanted him also to submit something like 500 Wallachian children to the Sultan. And that's when he nailed their heads with the turban and sent them packing home. Okay, so obviously at that point, jihad was declared, and according to the sources, Sultan Muhammad II, who actually is famous for conquering Constantinople, 1453, invaded. And at this point, now Vlad only has something like 7,000 to 10,000 men, a bunch of poke herds and cow and farmers who don't even have real weapons or armor, compared to this massive military, the Ottomans, which is armed to the teeth. So they engage in guerrilla warfare and especially terror tactics. And so this is where the impalement comes from. He started all the Muslims and the Turks and the Ottomans and those working for the Ottomans that he would capture, he would have them all impaled, to the point that there was something called the Forest of the Impaled, which surrounded one of his castles. And it apparently went on for miles. And it was just, as you see sometimes in the movies, just people constantly impaled. And at that point, when and he engaged in other attacks during this invasion. There's one memorable. It's all in my book, by the way, Defenders of the West. It's chapter 8. It's all dedicated to Vlad. But there's one memorable moment where it also comes out in the movies, where he did a night attack on the Sultan, and he just blitzed into the camp with several men with torches, looking for the Sultan to behead him, basically kill cut off the head of the snake and end the jihad. And they almost were successful. And even the Muslim sources that present him almost in a diabolical aspect, as if he's this black cloud that entered. And you may see that in some of the movies where I know there was this recent movie where they portray like this, he turns into bats and flies. That's where all that comes from. At any rate, after being harried constantly by these guerrilla warfare tactics, the Sultan reached the Forest of the Impaled, and was so just dejected and terrified by it, even though he understood impalement, but just the sheer carnage that he saw around him, that he decided to leave. Now, in the end, Vlad actually lost the war, and it was partially because of his brother, who was, like I said, that Sultan's boyfriend, essentially. And he sent him there with basically as a diplomat, and the people rallied to him because he was also a Wallachian. But he would bring them peace, etc. And now Vlad became this implacable, kind of ostracized guy that no one wanted to help him. And then the Hungarian king, who was supposed to come and aid him, and the Pope sent money for this, spent the money and decided, what am I going to do? I have no excuse. So when he finally came to Vlad, who was hiding out, and Vlad ran out to him, he actually imprisoned him and threw him in a dungeon for like over a decade. And this is when you get the stories where supposedly Vlad the Impaler is sitting in a dungeon, and because he's bored, he impales bugs and catches birds and impales them because he's a psychotic impaler. Now that's all part of the propaganda, because that same Hungarian king, this is right around the time of the Gutenberg press, and they used it very effectively. This is where you get all these wood carvings that show Vlad as this ant monster drinking blood. And extreme. So yeah, the Forest of the Impaled is real, and it's a terror tactic, and he was fighting fire against fire as a small force against this behemoth Ottoman force. But all the other stuff attributed to him is really, most historians will tell you that's just propaganda, it wasn't real. And that's the stuff that sort of carried over and came down and was passed on through legend, and that's what people want to talk about. This sort of drinking blood, and in fact, it's the Ottoman sultans, the father of Muhammad II, Murad, is the one who actually institutionalized drinking the blood of the Christians at the Battle of Varna in 1444. So anyway, I think you get the idea where, yeah, he was a pretty wild man. He fought fire with fire. He was feared by everyone, including Wallachians. There's a famous legend where, he brought so much justice into his land that there was this golden goblet put by a water fountain or waterfall, and no one would steal it. And the logic is they knew if they stole it, the punishment that would meet them at his hands, impalement, essentially. So he's definitely seen as a very fierce and cruel. But what he did was not really out of the standard compared to what was going on, and that's the fake part. We're not told what everyone else was doing, which was more or less the same. And then that's, Bram Stoker took the propaganda stories that came down and built on them, and then now he became a blood-sucking fiend floating at the night and drinking people's blood, and that's the Bram Stoker version that comes out in 1897. And the rest is history. That's who Vlad is now to us.
Yeah. And it seemed as though, from my understanding, Stoker really tried to write the story of Dracula, and you kind of alluded to this already, but he really tried to make it out like it was a work of just a history, a retelling of what truly happened. His encounter, he talked about how he was a vampire slayer and he encountered Dracula, and he really tried to pass it off as though it was a true story that truly happened. And then, of course, eventually this is now known as a work of fiction. Obviously his larger plans for that was not successful. But why do you think Stoker was originally trying to pass this off as something that truly happened? I mean, what was the motive, as far as you can tell, behind Stoker taking this story of obviously a complicated figure? We don't condone everything that was done under Vlad the Impaler, of course, but as you've already mentioned, we also have to look at him in context and recognize that he was living in just a brutal world in general. I mean, that period of human history was nothing short of brutal. But then Stoker now takes this and tries to act as though in the 1800s, the late 1800s at that, this is a true thing that happened. So what was the motivation, and what do you think originally caused Stoker to pick Vlad the Impaler?
Well, I don't think Stoker had any nefarious intentions per se. I think he was writing a novel, and he understood people would get that this is a novel, and he just wanted to give it an air of legitimacy. And as I said, if he did his research, and he did, the sources that he would come across would say more of the stuff that I told you was propaganda than the true story. The actual surviving literature, most of it, which came, like I said, during this Gutenberg kind of burgeoning time. So there's a lot of these propaganda tracts that were commissioned by the Hungarian king. They're the ones that will give you the sadistic, crazy, psychopathic Vlad the Impaler, who just wants to impale anyone he sees. So in that sense, he got the idea that this is a pretty unhinged kind of guy. And then the rest of it, the blood-sucking aspect, obviously everywhere. I mean, that's him adding to it. But I do think I don't have a bone to pick with him as much, being he's a novelist, as much as I do with modern day scholars and academics, because they know this and they discount the Bram Stoker version. That's just fiction. Everyone knows that. But they tend often to they'll uncritically accept the sort of propaganda. They'll accept the version of evil Vlad without the context, without the background, without telling you he was a hostage of the Ottomans. That's where he learned impalement, that he was abused, possibly sexually, by the Ottomans. His brother certainly was. That his whole family was killed. So you don't get that backdrop, which obviously made him a pretty ferocious person. So I would say, and this is the the point I'm trying to belabor about fake news and fake history, and and this is actually a topic that I've become more and more acute to, the concept of fake history. Because we know fake news, but we don't understand that there's another problem called fake history, which in my opinion is even more dangerous. Fake
Right.
news is sort of ephemeral, and it deals with, okay, there's some whatever, yesterday so and so said or did this, no they didn't, whatever. Fake history, on the other hand, it's what leads to these grand narratives where people kind of siphon reality through. So, for example, like the whole white people are the only enslavers in the world. It's thinking like that got a Rutgers University professor by the name of Brittany Cooper, a black woman, to say, quote, and I've memorized the quote, white people are committed to being villains. Okay, because in her world, only white people have been enslaved. And she literally says, I watched her video, like if it wasn't for white people, everyone got along. People, all brown, black, Asian, everyone just got along. And, I mean, the remarkable ignorance of such a statement, because of course slavery goes back to the very earliest form of history, and all peoples engaged in it. Black people enslaved white people before, vice versa, at least before the transatlantic slave trade. The Moors, okay, from Mauritania, the Berbers of North Africa, just in just the 16th century had 1.2 million white European slaves being sold on the markets. They went all the way to Iceland in the 16th century to get more slaves. Okay, and so we can get into that, but the point is, I've been really paying attention to this idea of or for example, it's the white man, and when I say white man, I also mean Christian, because that's, I think, kind of what they're really trying to do. It's sort of, the two go hand in hand, and the two are to be condemned. But so, the white man committed genocide in America. Christopher Columbus is a genocidal maniac. All the Europeans, they came and sadistically killed the poor native, Pocahontas-like natives who just wanted to be friends and, hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Which is, of course, all nonsense, because those people were committing cannibalism on each other and pulling their hearts out, and, all internecine, constant tribal warfare. So the idea is, I think it's important with Dracula and with all these topics that we're discussing in history, is to, I'll give you one final example. Saladin, you've heard, everyone's heard of Salah ad-Din, right? The great Ayyubid or Kurdish Sultan who defeated the Crusaders, who really, started the end of the decline of the Crusades. It took Jerusalem back in 1187 after it had been in Crusader hands since 1099. So amongst Westerners till this day, he's just like this wonderful, magnanimous, tolerant, excellent, sultan who unfortunately lived in this era that was marred by nothing but Crusader brutality. Okay, so and everyone can learn from him, not just modern day or not just the Crusaders, but I quoted a recent scholar saying even modern day Christians can learn from the magnanimity of Saladin. Okay, now the problem with this is Saladin in the sources acts every bit like ISIS. Okay, he had the Knights Templars and the Hospitallers in a ritual beheaded, just like something out of ISIS. Okay, like hundreds of them, and he sat there smiling. He had the true cross that the Christians venerated, whipped and upside down, dragged in the dirt and spat upon. And then we always hear of this wonderful, when he conquered Jerusalem in 1187. This is the point they always make. He didn't treat the Christians the way the Christians treated the Muslims when they conquered it in 1099, which was a bloodbath. Okay, but no, he let them all go. This is what Westerners will say. But if you dig into the Muslim sources, you find out, no, he actually allowed them to ransom themselves. And the ones who couldn't, which came out to 15,000 people, mostly women and children, were enslaved. And the Muslims just talked about how they couldn't wait until they raped the women and this and that, 15,000 people in total. And, when he became the Sultan of Egypt, and all of a sudden we find that the Coptic Christians who were living there, the native Christians, he started persecuting them and burning their churches and crucifying them and beheading them, even though they had nothing to do with the Crusades or the Franks. So obviously he had some animosity to Christianity, and his dying wish was, after he ejects all the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, that he wanted to pursue them in Europe until everyone became a Muslim or he died in trying. Now, I'm sorry, this sounds like ISIS to me, right? Not someone that we all need to venerate as this paragon of magnanimity, which is how he's been presented. Now, the whole point of this is to show you, when people believe in the fake history Saladin, the magnanimous, tolerant one, and then you show them Muslims today like ISIS doing whatever, they're going to say, well, why should I believe ISIS has true Islam? Look, there were guys like Saladin, who is portrayed as pious, and everyone knew, he was reading Quran and praying 5 times a day. So if he was a great guy, then obviously you can't say that ISIS's version of Islam is the correct one, and that makes sense. But when you find out, no, he actually fits into a perfect continuum of jihadists from the time of Muhammad to ISIS, the 14 centuries, then if anything, he confirms the ISIS vision of Islam. So my point is, this is the dangers of fake history. It's being used to make you believe in certain overarching narratives that challenge reality in the now.
Yeah, and of course, at the time of recording this, for those who may be listening to the playback, it is currently Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, for those who celebrate. And so everyone today is currently talking about history and revisionist history, because I think many individuals in America, at least, are starting to wake up to the fact that the story of Columbus has been taught to us by public education in a not so honest light. And so many individuals are starting to understand that, Christopher Columbus is often portrayed as a genocidal figure. In fact, there's an old clip of Kamala that's going viral of just a few years back, her talking on Columbus Day about how white Europeans brought about such, horrific violence to these indigenous populations that were living here. And you've already alluded to the fact that there was actually cannibalism and human sacrifice going on, and many of these tribes were warring against one another. And at the end of the day, I don't need anyone to listen to what I'm saying, or what you're saying, Raymond, and just take us at face value. The larger point is, do your own research. And specifically, I would encourage everyone to go to original sources, because at the end of the day, if you don't believe what Raymond's saying about Saladin, for example, well, then go do your research, because whether we like it or not, many individuals have been given the Saladin treatment or the reverse Saladin treatment. And Columbus is one of those examples where we're seeing the reverse Saladin treatment. And then, of course, we see so many other individuals, who are really complicated figures and have a very sketchy history to themselves, being venerated as heroes. And any individual who likes to portray history as white hats versus black hats, good versus evil, I don't think that they're doing an honest job of portraying history, because the Christian belief, of course, is that we are all fallen, that we are utterly depraved and in need of a savior. And as such, in this fallen world, we're going to be sinful, and we're going to be wicked and cruel. And there's going to be individuals that react to things in a way where, we could see in the story of Vlad the Impaler, he had a incredibly hard upbringing. And so you can criticize his tactics all you want, and I'm not going to argue whether or not you're right or wrong in doing so. Ultimately, my hope for this episode is just what Raymond's been hitting on, that you will start to understand that history is never a simple narrative of good versus evil, and you have to truly evaluate history in context. What happened to this individual? What happened, 100 years to the country that this individual is born in, before we could truly understand, when we see these big figures in the world pop up, whether they be someone you consider to be a good guy or a bad guy, there's always going to be context surrounding them. And we can look at that in modern day with President Trump, as you've already alluded, Raymond. Obviously, we've seen a lot of character assassinations against him, but we can also look back in the history and see the rise of Donald Trump. You can actually predict his political movements when you look back at his history. You see him appearing on Oprah, in the 80s and the 90s, and talking about how America is being ripped off by globalist elites, and the different trade agreements that are being ushered in by corrupt politicians. And so it's not so hard to actually picture the 2016 run that happened with Donald Trump. But so many individuals who were not paying attention to politics at all viewed Trump as this celebrity that so many people liked. And then suddenly one day a switch was flipped, and he's actually a secret racist, and we all have to disavow him and condemn him and his family, and ostracize those who support him. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's just not how history works. There's nothing happens in a vacuum. And that's ultimately what we are hammering on here. So feel free to contribute anything additional to that.
No, I think that's a great summation. That's the point. As you speak, all these different historical examples keep flooding in my mind. And it really distills down to there's a very concerted effort to use fake history in two ways. One, to take Christian Europeans and always demonize anything they do, okay, which is going to lead to the narrative that they're just evil people, all right? And then take Muslims, non-Christians, etc., and completely whitewash everything they did. Muslims are the premier example of this phenomenon. And the whole point is, at least to make everything look balanced, because if you look at history, it's everyone else attacking Christians, maybe Christians fighting back once in a while, like the Crusades. Okay, but it's so obvious in so many manifestations. And so the Crusades, just to give you an idea, everyone knows about the Crusades, right? You always hear about the Crusades. That's not something new. But they're really a drop in a bucket of the totality of warfare between Muslims and Christians for ideological reasons. Okay, so why is it we know the Crusades so much? Because the Crusades are the only instance where you have masses of Europeans going to the Islamic world, and so that inherently looks bad. It immediately makes the Europeans and the Christians look like they're the aggressors and the Muslims are the defenders. And I believe that is why it is so popular, because it's the only example that the whole world can point to and say, look, see, they're the bad guys, obviously. But even in that, if you understand history and you understand the concept of just war, that too was a defensive war, the Crusades, because all those lands were Christian lands that Muslims conquered and stole in the preceding centuries before the Crusade. So even in that sense, but whether it's the the so-called Moors in Spain, where they try to present it like it's a golden age when it was nothing but pure carnage, even during the very small golden age. Some of the worst atrocities happened then, and all according to Islamic Sharia law and so forth, very ISIS type stuff. Or as we were talking in the Vlad kind of theater in the Balkans, much later under the Turks, or what happened to the Russians and the other Slavic peoples under the Mongols when they became Muslim and again enforced the sort of Islamic worldview, jihadists, etc. And here's again another part of the historical game. While a lot of, let's say, historians are aware of all of these, they never connect them as being part of Islam. They'll talk about Arabs and Moors and Saracens and Berbers and Tatars and Mongols and Turks, right? They won't talk about what glued them all and what propelled them into attacking Europe and Christians. But if you do look at the sources, it was the same rationale of ISIS. Okay, it was jihad. They were quoting the Quran. They were quoting Muhammad and trying to follow his example, etc., etc. So it's such a clear message. There's so much continuity, past and present, but they've done everything to just muddle it up, and it looks like a bunch of disparate warfare going on. This group against that group, no different than when Europeans are fighting each other. But like I said, and then you find the Christians. I'll give you a final example. There's a book that I reviewed by an academic, I think from Georgetown, Robert Polk, I want to say. It's called Crusade and Jihad. And the book's it's a tome, it's like 1,000 pages. And the subtitle is like the 1,000-Year War between something like Islam and Christianity. It's very much like my Sword and Scimitar, 14 centuries of war between the West. In fact, my literary agent told me about it because he thought it would be a competitor. Anyway, I got the book to review it. And like I said, it's 1,000 pages. Literally the first, from the rise of Islam in the 7th century until 1800s. So we're talking over 1,000 years are given like 40 pages in this 1,000 page book. Okay. Just blitzed through, very generic. You don't even get the idea that Islam was waging a jihad or that Islam conquered 3/4 of what was once the Christian world, until he gets to the colonial era. And now you have strong Europeans entering the Islamic and the non-Christian world in general and colonizing the area. And that's all he focuses on, and just how bad the Europeans were, and the poor Muslims and the poor Indians or whoever, and how they just wanted to be free, etc. And he goes into extreme details, and he pulls them out of context. So you're left with the message thinking that, hey, I just read a book about the 1,000-year confrontation, and the first 1,000 years are missing, right? Because they don't matter, even though that's what I focus on. That's where all the meat is. And then he just focuses in and zooms in on what Europe did, in that 1 century that it was powerful, which, by the way, is nothing like what Muslims did. Actually, Europe went into those lands and made them better. And a lot of indigenous people from the Middle East and Africa will tell you that, okay, that under colonial rule, their lives were actually better. Okay, whereas when Muslims entered and did what they did, they just ransacked and plundered and destroyed oftentimes. So, there's so much truth out there, and it's all being intentionally manipulated to maintain all these narratives.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that people are so careless with history in that regard. I know that there's been a couple others that have been trying to do their best to give a more balanced take. I know Rodney Stark's put out a few different things. I'm sure you're familiar with his work because he's writing in the same vein, covering the Crusades and a lot of Christian history and understanding, where Christians fit in history. He talks a lot about the victory of reason, about how Christianity really led to the rise of the sciences, and which led to so many incredible institutions that we now take for granted today, such as hospitals and orphanages and things of that nature. And it was the Christians' hospitality and caretaking that led to so many of those interventions. Which I think is where, when we go back to Vlad the Impaler, I think that's where individuals like Vlad become tricky figures in history, because at the end of the day, I think many individuals are going to be tempted to look at Vlad, and in fact, a friend of mine was talking about this with me the other day, and talked about how Vlad the Impaler was a really terrible guy. And in some ways I can understand what he means. Of course, when you look at the acts of Vlad the Impaler, I mean they send shivers up my spine. They're horrifying to even consider. I think the main reason why individuals look at Vlad and like to think that about him is because, even if you want to give all the context of these things that happened of Vlad leading up to his reign of power, with the Ottoman Empire essentially kidnapping him at a young age, and what they did to his brother and his father, and all these loved ones around him. So many Christians in 2024 still want to just look and say, yes, but the Christian ethic should have been enough to guide Vlad to not impale people, and to not provide some of the dark actions that he did. So I guess my question to you is what kind of lessons should we be learning from Vlad's story? Because there's obviously truth to the fact that he did horrific things, and we don't want to dismiss that. But then simultaneously, we want to also view him as even-handedly as possible. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, look, in the end, Vlad, it was a fallible man, like all men. And but he was also put, as you pointed out, in a very tough situation, and he was a ruler, and he was trying to protect his people. And you're outnumbered, you're weak, you're going to resort to terrorism. That's what happens today, right? And that's what he did. So he engaged in what would be terror tactics against the Ottomans, and it worked, at least to some measure. And the thing is, the Romanians know about him and his history better than you and I do. And to them, he's a hero. I think I read somewhere, when it comes to like the top 5 or 10 historical figures in Romania that are most venerated, he's up there. So there must be. He's understood. Yeah, he's the kind of guy that you just don't mess with. Basically, if you do the right thing and don't do anything, that's the whole goblet story. If you don't transgress, then you'll be fine. If you do, it's going to be the most extreme punishment imaginable. So he was like from 0 to 100 when it came to retribution. So one can make whatever one wants about that, whether one likes or dislikes that, and I think that's fair. I don't think there's anything specifically Christian about what he did. I don't think it's also not Christian to engage in just war, which is actually at least defending yourself and your people versus violent invaders. So in the end, but the thing, again, for whoever wants to judge Vlad, to keep in mind is, Saladin did the same sorts of things, and he's extolled as this wonderful man in the West. So how come Vlad is this monster? And here again, we come down to the bottom line, which is not so much what these men did, it's what we're told and what we're not told. So we've been told what he did and then some, and then exaggerated. And then all these other guys who've done similar, possibly worse things, we've been told nothing about that. And that's why he stands out, right? Because, but like I said, everything he did had been done and was done and continued to be done, before and after him. So it's really the reputation and the rumor that was attributed to him. And that's where it really comes down to how one wants to understand that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately it's up to the listener of this podcast to really do your own homework and come to your own conclusions about Vlad. But I think if nothing else, I'm hoping that this episode has at least given you something to chew on, to understand that history does not happen in a vacuum, and we all need to truly come to our conclusions with an educated opinion and not just a impulsive opinion. And in that same conversation with my friend, I made an impulsive comment about how Vlad wasn't that bad of a guy because he was defending the West from from those who wanted to see its downfall, and and he rightfully kind of corrected me on that, and it's like you really don't know what Vlad's done. And then I started looking into it, and it's like, yeah, Vlad was not in the same vein as maybe King Alfred or some of these other figures that you've written about as well. But either way, the point still stands that both of us were kind of on opposite sides of the issue, and really, in some ways, it just goes to show that historical ignorance is just rampant, and we need to do our best, if we're going to have strong opinions, at least, to really come with our research. And if you don't have your research, then just hold those opinions loosely. And I think that's maybe the sort of takeaway that we can come to with this episode. But yeah, Raymond, I want to go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of let people know where they can follow you and your work, and if they want to learn more and read more about these historical figures, which of your books to pick up.
Sure. Well, my website has everything. It has all. You can contact me, my social media links. It has links to my books and all my articles and my videos. And it's just RaymondIbrahim.com, RaymondIbrahim. And if you want to get a book, my last one, which is Defenders of the West, I was actually looking at it to get quotes about Dracula. So this is where Dracula's in this book, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam. Basically, it's like 8 biographies, 8 different men, one of whom is Vlad, but there's others who are, less brutal and more of the heroic framework, I guess you could say, from a Christian point of view. Yeah, there's the other book too, Sword and Scimitar, before that, which deals with the total history of Islam versus the West, more comprehensive. But Defenders of the West, I think people really like, because it's a narrative, it's kind of a story, and it's still legit. It's all backed up and referenced with sources.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Raymond. And yes, listeners, do check out Raymond's work. He's done a whole lot of the legwork so that you don't have to. But of course, feel free to check your own historical sources, and I'm sure that Raymond will be happy to point you in the direction. If you have any questions about any of his work, I'm sure that you can contact him at his website. So, but we thank you all for listening and joining us. Those of you who watched live, and those of you who watched the playback, feel free to follow me at Forge and A on Twitter or X. And then, of course, check out the Substack, Forge and Anvil.substack.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you